online forum about improving health equity of young people and the role of social enterprise. For those of you I don't know, my name is Jo Barraquette. I'm the Director of the Centre for Social Impact at Swinburne University and also the lead on this particular project that we're presenting some findings from and enjoying some discussion about today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that wherever you might be in Australia, you are on Aboriginal land, and pay my respects to elders past and present of the lands upon which I am, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Acknowledge the relationship between people and country, and acknowledge country itself. It's great to be doing this today. It's the culmination of 3 years of work involving many people. For those of you who know how CSI Swinburne and indeed the whole CSI network rolls, it's typically a co-production, and that's very much the nature of this project. Before we get into outlining the agenda and getting on with it, I just wanted to make a few other acknowledgements and also housekeeping. First, to note that we are recording the Zoom today, but I also wanted to let you know that we are very privileged to have Jessamy G from Think in Colour working behind the scenes to do a graphic recording of both the presentation from myself and the panellists, but also your comments and discussion. So we hope, time allowing, that at the end of the session, Jessamy will be able to share that graphic recording with you briefly so that we can all see a picture of what we discussed today and what directions it took us in. And we'll share that with you subsequently after the event. I also wanted to acknowledge there are a couple of important people working behind the scenes. YLab, which is a social enterprise of Foundation for Young Australians, is our host and moderator team today. And I particularly wanted to acknowledge Marta and Ruby from YLab, who will be behind the scenes. So we wanted you to know that they're there and they're not disembodied people, they're real. Marta is definitely the Wizard of Oz today, with significant control over the tech aspects of things, and Ruby will be keeping time, so you may occasionally hear us making comments to Ruby as she sends us messages, because we all like to talk too much. I also wanted to acknowledge Green Fox Training Studio, which is a graphic design social enterprise that works with people who are seeking work opportunities after leaving the justice system, and thank them very much for designing today's slides and also for a number of the outputs that Perry Campbell will be showing to you a bit later in the session. So in terms of what we're going to look at today, I'm going to do my very best to give you a contained summary of the project itself, the questions and our key findings. We're really aware that in this kind of mode, well, in any mode really, talking incessantly at you for hours is not particularly productive. So I'm going to try and contain my, my comments to about 15 minutes. We'll then be moving into our panel discussion, which is going to be really, I guess, we hope, the really interesting part of the event, which will involve hearing from people who are, involved in the various aspects of practice that relate to this particular project, reflecting a little bit on the research, but also on what's going on in the here and now, because we're obviously in the middle of extreme circumstances in relation to the issues we're looking at. That part of the event will be facilitated by my esteemed colleague, Professor Jane Farmer, and we'll then obviously have time for questions and comments. We're really aware that there's a number of people on this webinar today who themselves have deep experience in the area, including a few people from the case study social enterprises. Jane's in charge of Q&A, so I won't determine what you will do, but I do hope that you'll feel comfortable to ask questions, but also, provide your own insights, both about what we found in this research and also what it means for, building forward better, to slightly shift a now hackneyed phrase. The other thing is that the Australian Research Council, who is the primary funder of this project, kindly made an allowance when COVID hit that allowed academics to use their project budgets in slightly different ways. So where normally we would spend a bit of money on travelling in order to present the research, we're doing that virtually, and that's meant that we can do quite a bit of research translation. So towards the very end of the session, apart from Jessamy giving us a quick glance at the graphic recording, we'll also, a few members of the team will just very briefly reflect on where we think we need to go next in terms of future research, because for those of you who know what CSI Swinburne does, this is one project in a much wider program of research about social enterprise and social innovation. And obviously, you know, when you do one project, it makes you think about all the other projects you need to do. So given that Marta is in charge of slides, I'll ask you to flick through, Marta. I've already provided some acknowledgements of important people. Like any project that we work on, it's highly participatory and it's always something of a co-production. So both this event, but also the research itself. I'd particularly like to acknowledge our industry partners, social traders, Vic Health in particular, who are the major financial industry partner to the project, and the Foundation for Young Australians, and also acknowledge the Australian Research Council for their funding. I'd like to acknowledge, without reading out all of their names, my esteemed research team members. We do everything as a team, and everyone's played a particular and important role in the project. We particularly want to acknowledge our research participants. The research is based on in-depth case studies with 4 social enterprises, 2 in Victoria and 2 in New South Wales. And from those case organisations, 93 people chose to participate in interviews with us. So we acknowledge all of those people. For research ethics reasons, I can't name the social enterprises that participated, but they're entirely welcome to out themselves as having been part of the project. So if you guys are online and you want to out yourselves to the group, please do that in the chat function. If you do it, I will then, you know, retrospectively acknowledge that you've done it. Can we move on, please, Marta? So just to give you a bit of background about the project, where it started, and I'm going to try not to spend too much time on background and set up and spend more time on the findings in the brief time we've got. But just to give you a quick overview, there's youth health equity in Australia in relative terms to other countries is fairly solid and strong. That said, we do know that young people from particular demographic groups and from particular geographies continue to experience health inequities. And that's, you know, one of the underpinning reasons why this research needs to be done. We know, and obviously what's going on right now has reinforced what was already a very significant problem, which is that young people, particularly the age bracket we're looking at is between 15 to 24 years old, experience significant exclusion and or precarity in the labour market in terms of access to decent employment. That, you know, what was a problem when we started this project is probably double a problem now. There was some good news in the budget last week, but it's not going to be enough to redress everything. And then the other thing that was a background is that there has been increased interest in WISE, which is an acronym for Work Integration Social Enterprises. I'll explain in a minute. About their role in improving health equity outcomes, including economic participation for people from all sorts of different groups. But the thing that's interesting about the literature so far is, you know, we get these grand conclusions, social enterprise does this, but very few researchers have actually explained how. So this was also another point of the project is, you know, how, like what's the secret sauce, which was a metaphor that emerged early on in the project. Glad to see that Work Ventures has outed itself as one of the case studies. Thanks for doing that, Janine. Marta, can we move on? So the key research questions that guided us were really these questions about how do social enterprises affect the social determinants of health equity for young people? And related to that, how is what are the organisational features? So what's specific about social enterprises is hybrid business models that produce these kinds of outcomes. And then recognising that, you know, social enterprises don't operate in a vacuum. They operate in an operating environment that includes institutional pressures and you know, institutional enablers. We also wanted to know, well, what are those factors and how do they affect what's going on? So we'll move on, Marta. The key concepts in all of this, and I won't spend too much time labouring over them, I think for the large majority of this audience, you'll know what most of these mean, but recognising that not everyone will be at the same place of experience with these concepts. Social enterprises ultimately are businesses that are led by a social purpose rather than by maximisation of private profit. Work integration social enterprises are the focus in this study, and they are a model of social enterprise that create pathways to employment or employment opportunities, typically for people who are experiencing some kind of significant barrier to mainstream work and employment opportunities. Young people, as I said, we define as young people aged 15 to 24. And we focus particularly on young people who are experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage or place-based disadvantage, the two often being interlinked. Social determinants of health equity, for those who are not public health or health promotion people, really refers to a sort of social model of understanding health and well-being, and refers to the conditions that produce better or worse health equities. One way they've been described are the causes of health inequality or health equalities. In terms of organisational features, what are we talking about? We're particularly interested in actually trying to unpack which aspects of organisation mattered in the research, but our starting point included things like the business structure, the nature of leadership in the organisation, the organisational culture, and the industries in which the work integration social enterprises, or WISEs as I'll call them now, were working. Institutional factors, we typically think about those as being public policy, but actually we're talking a bit more broadly than that. So we're interested in industry and societal norms as well as public policy in what we were looking at. So we'll move on, Marta. Why was the research needed? Well, you know, we don't know enough about the how. I've already explained, and I think the other thing is that, you know, unpacking some of this can be useful for policymakers for understanding what value social enterprises might add to existing policy responses, but also to social entrepreneurs and social enterprise leaders around what are the design factors that create more or less impact in terms of social determinants of health. And we'll move on. In terms of the methods, I won't go through this in detail. For the researchers who are on the call, on the webinar, please do see the project reports for very detailed descriptions of the methodology. But in very broad terms, as I've said, it was 4 case studies. We attempted to be as participatory in nature as we can without treading too heavily on the time of people who, you know, frankly don't have a huge amount of time to contribute to research, and quite rightly so. We started with 2 preliminary engagement workshops, which involved young people, social entrepreneurs and social enterprise managers, and public health professionals to talk about, you know, what we were trying to do and what are the key questions that needed to be asked. We then selected our case studies, and within those case studies involved engagement workshops with staff and directors of the case study organisations, interviews, participant observation in the enterprises themselves, and various other aspects of data collection. We analysed the results for each individual case study and prepared a report for them, but then we did cross-case analysis to make best sense of the research. We're now in the process of translating, and I won't talk about that because we're doing it. And as I said, Perry will give you a bit of a show and tell later in the session in terms of some of the outputs from the project. So now we'll move on to the findings. And Marta, thanks. So in terms of, you know, the overall findings, big picture, we certainly found that each of the Ys involved in the study significantly increased young people's social participation, and that was, you know, quite notable across every case study. Young people's economic participation, if we think about that in terms of receiving income and also gaining jobs, increased not so much, but there are some reasons for that, which I'll explain a bit later. But what we did find, and what the young people told us, was that they felt much more equipped to be employed, And people involved in the social enterprises and social enterprise partners also noted that they felt that the young people were definitely on the path to much stronger employability as a result of their WISE participation. With this particular cohort, by which I mean young people, obviously, you know, within an age range of 15 to 24, you've got people at different life stages with different things ahead of them that they want to do. So not everyone was actually seeking a job out of the programs in which they were involved. We also found that young people experienced improved connection to housing, transport and support services that they needed to do well in life. And that was an effect of the WISE's work, and I'll talk about that a bit later. Income, as I mentioned, varied, and it partly varied depending on the types of programs that were offered within the social enterprises and also the kinds of commercial activity that they were engaged with. Thanks, Marta. We'll move on. In terms of health and wellbeing outcomes for young people, we saw largely positives and a couple that we'd say, you know, need some attention. In terms of the positive, and that was really the overwhelming finding, in particular, young people talked with us about their increased self-confidence and self-efficacy, so their sense of agency in the world, which was very much linked to the positive recognition that they received and also the positive self-recognition that they developed as a result of being valued members of a team, working with others and being, you know, in a workplace setting. Across the board, young people involved indicated that they felt their mental health had improved, and that was particularly the case for young people who had pre-existing clinical diagnoses related to mental health. This linked very much to the self-confidence that they developed as a result of learning new technical and social skills, also to the relationships that they built and the opportunities to talk about how they felt, to receive feedback and also occasionally take some care, for example, from the therapy animals that were available at the social enterprises. Another thing that came up across mental health and the next one, which is sleep patterns, was around time structure. Quite a lot of young people, and in particularly in the social enterprise that was in a regional area, talked a lot about the fact that they were having more structured, better sleep, partly because they had a routine, because they were working regular hours, partly because staff in the WISE were modelling different ways of being. These were interesting, you know, these had interesting effects. Another thing that came out was around healthier behaviours. Sleep patterns are one of those. I'm not sure if sleeping's a behaviour, but nutritional awareness and better diet was something that came out, particularly for those 2 of the 4 social enterprises that themselves were in food industries. So one of the social enterprises was a catering and cafe business. The other had a farm and was doing food production and retail. The stronger nutritional awareness from those 2 cases came out of the one where food was being produced. So the young people who were actually working on the farm, particularly, were getting immediate access to opportunities around food and growing their interest in learning, and reported that as a result they were both producing and consuming better food. And we'll move on, Marta. In terms of the the negative outcomes, although I'm not, we don't want to suggest that they're particularly negative outcomes in terms of the enterprises. And thank you, Kylie, for outing Green Connect as another one of the case studies. One was, despite the outcomes around food that I just mentioned, for young people who were on site at social enterprises that themselves didn't have good immediate proximity to good quality food. So one of them in particular was in what we might call a food desert. Those young people were, consuming poor quality food or not consuming food because it was too costly while they were at work. So that was a bit of a problem. Another one is just to note that because we don't have a huge proliferation of WISE working with young people in Australia, some of the young people we talked to were travelling 3 hours a day, and STREAT's just outed itself, thank you STREAT. They were travelling up to 3 hours a day to participate, and while for the large part that none of them complained about that, it was quite apparent to us as researchers that there was a pretty huge burden on them in terms of getting to and from workplaces, sometimes very late at night or very early in the morning. The other thing I think, which is more about the operational context for social enterprise and WISE in particular, is that there was the reproduction of some industry norms which are not really great that we saw, and in particular gendered behaviour that presents in some industries did appear, and it wasn't actually the social enterprises doing it, it was partners to the social enterprise and or the norms that occur simply on site when you've got people who have, you know, a history of working in a particular industry that, you know, for one reason or another is a bit exclusionary. And we'll move on, thanks. We looked beyond the outcomes for young people to look at everyone else and who were affected by this. That was part of our holistic organisational approach. And we found, which wouldn't surprise those of you who work in the field, that staff and volunteers of the WISE experienced very rewarding relationships. They appreciated the safe and caring and inclusive workplaces in which they operated, but they also, a lot of them were feeling burnout as a result of excessive emotional labour and also as a result of the fact that WISE are operating on very thin margins, if any margins at all, which means that everyone's working their guts out all the time. Moving on, Marta, just conscious of time and I want to wrap up. In terms of effects on partners and the wider community, we did see some improved local services system capability as a result of the WISEs being there, and I'll talk about that in a second. There was some kind of leakage from WISE to other organisations of inclusive work practices, but for the most part this wasn't the case. Because we know that most of the partners to the social enterprises themselves already had quite strong values alignment. There was a little bit of particularly in the regional area, so in relation to Green Connect, there was a little bit of evidence about WISE offering strategic alignment through in terms of what local industry needed in terms of the young people coming out of the programs. And we'll move on. Marta? In terms of the macro level impacts on health inequities, because I think that's one of the issues of social enterprise, every time we look at an individual organisation, while we can't expect it to change the world, I think there's a lot of aspirations among social entrepreneurs that that's exactly what they're about. We did see that, you know, because of the very assets-based and positive focus on young people and their value, their contribution, rather than seeing them as some kind of in some kind of deficit mode, that social enterprises really were, you know, changing the narrative about young people in a positive way. There was capillary action, which relates to this coordination of services within systems. And because social enterprises are hybrids, working in their supply chains with the corporate sector and other businesses, they tended to draw in resources that other traditional forms of employment services weren't doing. But also, moving on to the macro constraints in my final minute, you know, there are issues around industry norms that I've mentioned. The precarity for young people in the labour market is not something that individual social enterprises can overcome on their own, and a lot of young people recognise that. Also, really, we need to call out that at the moment, social enterprises are not recognised formally in our employment services systems, and that's a problem, and also that they continue to struggle to gain access to appropriate capital. I'm just going to flick past the next slide, Marta, and go to my final one, and then I'll stop. So what did we find? I think the large majority of us who work in this area already know a lot about the wraparound support that WISE offer, and we don't need to labour on that. But what was interesting was that the social enterprises that offered multiple work streams and or different sites in which to do different kinds of work, that was where the young people indicated, you know, a lot of development. So it wasn't just about being in a work arrangement, it was about being having multiple opportunities to learn about different skills and also what they liked in the world. And as I said, promoting the strengths of young people and positive and inclusive workplaces. And with that, I'm going to stop so that we can move on to hear from our esteemed panel. I'm going to go away and I'll come back during Q&A so that you can ask any questions you want. Hello.
Am I heard? That's good. Can't hear myself. That's good. All right. Thank you, Joe. That was amazing, and also rather beautiful to look at. So it's my role now to chair the panel and the Q&A. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we all now meet and their elders past, present and emerging. So I'd like to introduce the panel first before moving into questions. I will ask a few questions and then it will be over to you, audience, to ask some questions. So get your questions ready and put them in the Q&A as we proceed. And so first of all, we have on our panel Kate Barelle. Kate is the co-founder and chief impact officer at STREAT. She has a background in clinical and forensic psychology. And she also sits on the STREAT board. And as well as that, she works as a freelance consultant on projects that aim to assist disenfranchised youth. And secondly, we have Michael Lim, is the senior manager at YLab and the Foundation for Young Australians. Michael has a busy life in these organisations, implementing education programmes to contribute to youth employment. He also is the CEO of a non-profit called Community Health Advancement and Student Engagement, or CHASE, which is a great name, which improves health literacy among high school students across Melbourne's western suburbs. And thirdly, we have Kirstan. Kirstan Corben is the executive manager at programs group Vic Health. Kirstan's background is in physiotherapy and health promotion, and she has a deep commitment to putting equity at the heart of Vic Health's work. Kirstan works in a broad agenda spanning sport and physical activity, healthy eating, mental well-being, alcohol and tobacco. Okay, so awesome panel. What we want is basically, I guess, each one of you, starting with Kate, then Michael, then Kirstan, to talk about what the research findings mean for you and your organisation in relation to wellbeing work and young people. We'll start with you, Kate.
Excellent. Thank you, Jane. Thank you for having us, and a big thank you to the whole team for doing the research. The difference this kind of research makes for us is phenomenal. Like, it's actually very hard to put a value on it because it is quite invaluable. To have it done independently at such a high quality helps us hold up like a reliable mirror from an angle that is one where you don't always see yourself at, and it lets us see the things we're doing well, but more importantly, the things that we can change, the things that we can adjust or modify in order to get an even better impact for the young people that we're working for. So at an enterprise level, that helps us plan, helps us change strategy, and sometimes adopt programs down at the small level as well. At the participant level, the trainees that your team interviewed, they were always a bit cautious about this kind of thing, but they loved the process because it was so respectful and people were so curious and they felt really valued to be a part of it. So that thing around giving them a voice was very important. And the other thing that I think is incredibly important, if you zoom the system level, I'm really pleased that you've taken the time to do a policy document around this, where you're translating really important information for a really important audience and making it actionable. There's such a gap between all the knowledge we have and what to do with it. And that in turn will then support the sector, support our enterprise, other enterprises. I know a whole bunch of practitioners and students and policy people are going to be just eating this up because it's really valuable work. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Kate. That was awesome. All right, we'll hand over to you, Michael. What does this research mean to you and your organisation?
Thanks, Jane. Well, it means a lot. And speaking personally, I think I got a bit emotional hearing about the findings. I think my relationship with this research is sort of twofold. One being a young person myself. I'm 25, so I guess I fall out of that 15 to 24 age bracket, but I still consider myself a young person. So for me, a lot of the findings and a lot of the research really put words to experiences that I felt, that sense of confidence and belonging. A lot of my role with YLab is working within my local community. So as Jane mentioned in the introduction previously, was that I work on a lot of projects to do with young people and youth unemployment in Melbourne's West, specifically Brimbank, which is my local government. You know, I like to say that COVID's done to the policy environment with youth unemployment in 6 months what we've been trying to do in 5 years. So it's really sped up a lot of the things and a lot of the trends that we've seen. Organizationally, I think very similarly to Kate, is that it provided a sense, an additional sense of legitimacy to a lot of the things that we're doing, that we are doing some things correctly. There are obviously areas that we can improve on, and as YLab grows and develops and matures and starts to partner with different organizations, I think it's around that piece of how do we change the culture and capabilities of other organizations that we work with who may be in different industries. So to wrap up, very emotional, but also a very great thing, both for me personally and through my role at YLab. Brilliant.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Over to you, Kirstan. What about the research from Vic Health's point of view? And your organisation partly funded this research. So what's been learned by your organisation and yourself?
Thank you, Jane, and thanks for having me join today as well. Unlike Michael, I'm convincingly outside of this age group now, but I do have a lot of young people in my life, and I see it personally from that perspective too. So I've certainly got the personal connection to this work, but from a professional point of view, kind of reflect on Vic Health and the way we work as a health promotion foundation. We do work ourselves, but we also fund others to do work and to work alongside us. So this is an example of a piece of work that we've funded. We fund out about $29–30 million to other people to work in the areas that we care about. So for us, thinking about funding this piece of work, it really hit kind of 3 key places for us. The first there is about health equity. So health equity is something that Vic Health could not care more about, but it is something that for us has been complicated, very conceptual, very high level, and we've always been challenged around how to put it into practice and how to actually translate that to real world change. So this is an example where we've been able to take our Fair Foundations framework, a conceptual document, and see it applied in practice. So yeah, great opportunity for us from an equity point of view. Vic Health is an organisation that creates change as well. So we try to create change in policy and change in practice. And again, this piece of work as well has been touched on by the way Joe presented as well. There are opportunities here in both policy and practice to lead to some of that change, so that we saw that opportunity early. And as well, for us to create that change in a really genuine way, we need to partner with others, and we need to partner with atypical partners at times. And so again, this was an example where we brought together some new partnerships that were really going to help us create some of that change, particularly in social determinants of health and particularly with young people. So that first 25 years of life for Vic Health is a major area of focus. And the other point I would just really make, I guess, is that this research has been completed and been shared by Joe with us this morning, but that's not the end of the process. The big challenge for Vic Health now and our partners is to think about what have we learned from doing this piece of research, and how can we actually use those learnings, those insights, to create the change that we're talking about. So we really kind of think that the work is just beginning now around creating that change, and we'd really love the discussion today to really centre around how can we do something good as a result of this work. So thanks.
That sounds really great. That's what we want. We want to change the world. So let's do it with you for a start. All right. I noticed there's some great questions going into the Q&A. Please spill your questions in there. While you're doing that, I'm going to ask a couple of questions across the panel. We'll just go in the same formation as before. So the first question is, one finding from the study is that effective work integration social enterprises are inclusive employers. What is good inclusive employment of young people going to need to look like now and post-COVID? So let's go with you, Kate. What's your answer?
Oh, gee, suddenly got bigger there. It's a bit of a surprise.
It's frightening, isn't it?
Look, it's a good question, but I think for work integrated social enterprises, the answer feels obvious. It's like to keep doing what we're doing. So for me, the question is, how can we get mainstream employers to do that? So for the WISEs, it's business as usual, and probably more business than we're going to be able to keep up with in the sense of looking after people and people coming through. But we've been thinking about this thing of, I like to call it a two-way street. So it's all very well for us to work with young people to get them work ready. And in some ways, the easy part, it's not easy. There's enormous barriers that they overcome, and they do incredibly well. And we do that wraparound support thing. But there's an equal piece of the puzzle sitting on the other side, which is how to get employers people ready. And so we've started work in that space, working with our partner employers and bringing them into STREAT a little bit and bringing us into their place a little bit, much more than just the graduates they employ, but helping capacity build within their organisation so they can work inclusively, respectfully, in an informed and genuine way with not just our graduate and trainees, but they love it, because what they say is that this actually helps them with their entire workforce. So yeah, so my thing is about getting other external employers to adopt some of the from the kernels, some of the keys that were raised in this research, that social enterprises see. It's like the air we breathe. It feels normal for us. The question is why is it so hard to get other organisations to do it externally? And they're not bad. They're not trying to be bad people. It's just really hard to do it on scale, I think, when you're trying to make profit.
Absolutely. Okay, excellent. Right, Michael, over to you from the resident young person perspective.
I got to stop going after Kate. She keeps taking all of my points. I think very similarly, I think we know what good inclusive employment of young people was even before COVID. And those are projects that we worked on in Brimbank City Council through the regional employment trial, so the federally funded grants. And we worked in a partnership model with ArcBlue, Brimbank City Council, and Job Prospects. And what we found through a variety of co-design workshops that we had throughout 2019 and early 2020 was that there are sort of 4 key themes that young people wanted from their work and what they found has meaningful work. One of them was inclusion and diversity, so being able, and accessibility, so being able to access highly meaningful work locally. The next one was protection and job security, quality, and the last one was growth. So I don't think any of these things are changing post-COVID, but I think what we're seeing now is that these trends are only being accelerated. And I think the employment space and how we look at the whole employment ecosystem as a whole is coming more and more into the public conversation now that COVID's happening. So I think it's just very similar of how do we continue what we already know and how do we scale this from just a small localized version in Brimbank to maybe a regional level across the West and maybe across Victoria as well. Obviously, employment, as Joe mentioned at the start, doesn't exist within a vacuum. There are certain contextual factors that are unique to a specific area. So it's just about how do we scale this, but also to tailor it and be flexible and relevant for the local young people in those regions.
Thanks, Michael. Kirstan, what can an organisation like Vic Health do to influence inclusive employment for young people? What can your organisation do?
First of all, I guess I would highlight young people today, to me, are incredibly talented, absolutely amazing at expressing themselves, representing themselves. They have so much to offer to all parts of life, including the workforce. We work with some youth panels and so on, and I just get blown away every time we have conversations with them. But what I would say is in the context of today's environment, we have really seen kind of a drying up of work experience opportunities for young people. And thinking about coronavirus in particular, the way that is going to impact on future work opportunities for young people is really devastating, I would say. So those young people who are entering kind of employment type experiences are going to be less familiar with them than what they might have been in the past. So I agree with what Kate's saying is it's really about trying to get employers ready to work very well with these young people and be able to provide the right experiences for young people and get the potential out of the young people because they've got so much to offer. So I think a big part of that is employers being able to communicate really effectively with young people. There's also a lot that's been known for a long time about experiences of work. And if we're putting young people into situations where there are really high demands and low control for them over their job, that is going to be putting them very at risk and potentially be quite harmful for their overall well-being. So we need to make sure that we don't do that. So I think there are examples where we're doing really well, but we just need to make sure that we do better and we spread those examples so that they become the norm across the board.
Cool. Okay. The questions are coming in. People out there, put your questions in the Q&A, please. It's a bit hard for us to move between the chat and the Q&A. We're limited human beings. So put them in the Q&A. It's really good. Michael, I'm going to start with you this time, so you don't have to go after Kate. So another finding from the study is that Ys are not formally recognised in our National Employment Services System. Given labour market activations programmes are shown important for young people experiencing disadvantage, what do you think can be done to improve their availability or promote their value?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of similar questions in the Q&A. My 2 cents are sort of 2 parts. One part is I think forget the work integrated social enterprise and just think about educating people on the purpose of social enterprises. I think a lot of people or young people that I speak to as peers, and I say I work for a social enterprise, they don't even know what that is. And a lot of our partners previously, before working with YLab, have actually never worked with a social enterprise. So I think there is a broader education piece about just increasing the awareness of what a social enterprise is, what its purposes are, and what we seek to achieve between, achieving impact, quality, and also drawing an income from what we do. I think the second piece around is a sense of a broader legitimacy. So again, thinking a step beyond just the employment service system, social enterprises don't even have legitimacy as a legal entity. Like, we're not incorporated as a legal incorporation. So I think having that broader legitimacy from the legal system and a formal recognition from governments, and we are seeing it in different pockets, obviously in Victoria and New South Wales mainly. But having that sense of broader legitimacy, I think, will trickle down into getting legitimacy within the employment services system.
Great. Okay. Kirstan, I'm going to move to you next. So what do you see as a role here for you guys? You're kind of in there with government and policy, I guess. Can you do something here?
Yeah, look, I see it from both perspectives. I agree with Michael as well. And I think there's that kind of top-down, the policy orientation around how do we advocate for policy change and get the right recognition from this part of the sector. It's one thing to kind of put proposals to decision makers and MPs and so on and ask them to make those decisions, but really we also need to do the bottom-up mobilisation of community too. And again, I think today we've got much more acceptance of social enterprises, but we could go further. So if we're thinking about people, and we're also thinking about organisations, and organisations purchase a lot of goods and services, but if we were to increase that awareness around the value of social enterprises in the marketplace, then I think we've got opportunity there for organisations like Vic Health and many others to be procuring from these organisations, which is going to increase the viability of these organisations and lead to greater employment opportunities for young people from there.
Awesome. Right, Kate, now it's your go to have nothing left to say, but I don't think that's ever going to happen. So how about your answer to this question?
God damn it, they covered it well, didn't they? So I'll just tell you my feelings. I've got some big feelings about the fact that integrated social enterprises aren't not even recognised as a part of the employment system. We're not even connected in. It's so hard. We've spent 10 years struggling, banging our heads on a wall, not being able to connect in. It's really frustrating for us, but it's much more frustrating for the young people that we work with, because it's a difficult system for them to navigate. It's difficult for workers to navigate, difficult for organisations to navigate at the federal and the state level, really fractured. And I'm astounded that we haven't been integrated because of the phenomenal amount of contribution that social enterprises make into this area, particularly with young people with some of the highest and greatest barriers. There was a parliamentary inquiry into sustainable employment, and the report was released just recently. I accidentally discovered it. I don't expect anyone to kind of have me on their kind of speed dial list, but just breaking it down, we know there's about over 4,000 social enterprises in Victoria. About a third of them are work integrated social enterprises. I went through that inquiry report when I found it, had some excellent findings in there. There were about 6 submissions from WISEs. 2 of them were international. 2 of them were from large charities, which doesn't stop them from being WISEs, but they're a slightly different beast. We didn't know about it. There was no input from intermediaries. I didn't see any academics in there as well. Like, it just feels like the 2 systems are passing each other in the night, and that's such a loss. It's such a loss to the government, especially when WISEs do so much heavy lifting for people. Like, the best thing that could happen for a young person is actually to get out of the employment support system so that they're on their own 2 feet and working in a good environment. But I do think there needs to be much more coordinated and genuine engagement by government. That I take your point, Kirstan, the social procurement stuff is so important, and it's made such a game-changing difference for us, but that's different to engaging at that employment service provider level, at a system level. So there's something needs to happen to connect the systems up, and I think the government has more resources to be able to lean in towards us. We're leaning in, but we can't even find the right cracks. We find all the cracks, but we can't find the right crack to get into. So yeah, it really frustrates me that there's such a divide.
All right, gauntlet thrown down to multiple
That's the end
groups
of my
there,
feelings.
Kate. All right, awesome. So moving on to our last question, then it's over to you guys out there for your questions. So keep them coming into the Q&A box. We're going to start with you, Kirstan, this time. So interesting point, I thought, what comes out. Joe mentioned it a couple of times, that the research shows that Ys do improve the social determinants of health, obviously, but we also find some limitations, for example, around gender inclusivity, and knowing that Vic Health's particularly into this space. So what more could be done by Ys and their kind of partner stakeholders to kind of move the dial on these wider and really, really fundamental social determinants of health, do you think?
Yeah, look, I think from Vic Health's perspective, this is about inclusion, inclusion of all forms of diversity, and gender is the example that you brought up in that case. But I would say sexuality, culture, even intellect and expertise, and so on. And you can keep going. There's so many different forms of diversity. So Vic Health for many years has been working in this space around inclusion, and I think we'll continue to do so in many settings, but workplaces being a major setting there as well. And the other thing that really stands out for us linking to gender is some work that Vic Health's been leading around healthier masculinities, to understand what it means to be masculine and trying to reset or reframe healthier versions of masculinity. And I think some of the examples that have come out of this work as well, where there's been some workplaces or sectors that are more dominated by males, I guess, and some of those earlier types of masculinity would be settings for us where we could kind of go in and try to create some change and increase inclusion in the long run. So, and then I think the earlier mention I made as well of low job control being a feature of work that can be harmful to anybody, and sometimes having the wrong job or a poor job can be worse than having no job. So we just need to make sure as well that when we're giving these opportunities for employment, that they're good ones for people too.
Kate.
Hello again. I love this conversation. It's so good. What can be done to improve the conditions? For me, it comes back to that thing around getting employers ready for a diverse workforce. Again, so at the risk of repeating myself, I think, well, our ambition is not just to run programs that help young people get work ready. It's not just about treading lightly on our planet, but as I laughed earlier when Joe said that social practitioners and enterprises generally want to change the world. What we would love to do is change the mainstream employment system so that it is all of those things that Kirstan just said. It is inclusive on all of those dimensions by default. So that we don't need a social enterprise sector to do that. We have a social employment sector that does it, that isn't antisocial in the way it does it. And I know no one sets out to be harmful in this sense, but it's around. So the way we achieve that is we choose our employment partners, the people who employ our graduates. We choose them really carefully. We keep a small stable of them. We engage in a genuine long-term partnership with them, which is from the top all the way down to the manager on the floor who's working with employers. We invite them into our training. In fact, we make it a condition of our arrangement with them that they come and do this professional development with us. We're on speed dial. We do post-placement support at least weekly, fortnightly. But it's really intensive. It's as much work as we put into supporting them as we do into supporting the young person. Haven't worked out how to crack that on a big scale. But at the moment, we're definitely trying to do it bottom up. And some person cleverer than me has got the solution for doing it top down. That would be fantastic as well.
That's really cool. Right. So Michael, you have the last word on this.
Oh, it's a lot of pressure. I think what I would say is through our work with Brimbank, through that project, one of the things we did was run these co-design sessions related to how do we, co-design policy related to recruitment, retention and training. And what we found was that this was both with young people and employers. And one of the prototypes that we did come up with was a reverse recruitment portal. So it was based off the Work 180 model, where it was a female-friendly recruitment site. In this one, it was a youth-friendly recruitment site. So employers were incentivized to advertise all their youth-friendly policies related to things like inclusion, protection, quality of work, and as well as security. And I think what we found there was that employers and both young people wanted the same goal. And a lot of the social norms related to, or industry practices related to recruitment, retention, and training weren't actually fixed in stone. And a lot of the employers who were at those co-design workshops were more than happy to trial something new. So what it demonstrated to us, although those prototypes weren't able to be scaled massively across Brimbank, but what it did demonstrate to us was that employers, big employers local to Brimbank, had the appetite to do something differently. They had the appetite to experiment and to iterate with, you know, really a bunch of young people who they wanted in their workforces, and these young people wanted a job. So everyone had the same goal, and having that alignment allowed us to co-design some really, really cool policies that could change the behavior and norms of industries, very diverse industries. So we had library services from Brimbank City Council. We had another employer who fitted emergency services vehicles, so SES and ambulance. So we're at the stage now of being able to see whether these prototypes can, one, be relevant in these different industries, but as many will face, I think, in the social enterprise sector, is just this concept of scale. Can we do this on a bigger scale than just a regional or a local context? And that's a question we still need to answer.
Something about influencing the whole system, isn't there, from where you are? All right, we've come to the end of my sort of throwing questions at the panel. Now it's over to you people out there to throw questions at the panel. Jo's going to help me with this because I think she might have been sitting there analysing all these questions. I'm going to start with one from Mark at Social Traders. So I think what Mark's basically asking here is, so he says, I'm really interested in hearing more about the impact on employment pathways and employability. So my interpretation of this is that he wants to kind of focus down on what happens to people when they get into employment and what are the pathways into employment and how bumpy or okay are they. All right, so look, we might start with Kate.
Lovely. Great question, Mark. My initial thoughts are to really state the obvious. Pathways, training pathways into employment, I think, need to be a pathway and stepping stones rather than a set pathway, so that young people can, you know, they can try out a bunch of stepping stones. So that speaks to the importance of one of the findings in this research, which is that a range of work and work experience is really important. So people can work out what they enjoy along the way, because you don't necessarily know that up front. So the flexibility, tailoring it to the individual is obviously really important. Many years ago when we started, we had a very, you know, shiny, carefully thought out plan. And then of course we ended up breaking it down into lots of tiny pieces because one plan didn't fit even two people, let alone everybody. So, the capacity to mix and match, and you know, we're really excited at STREAT. We've finally been able to move beyond just hospitality pathways. So we've now got horticulture pathways, and we kind of start talking about ourselves as a food system social enterprise, because then that raises possibilities of maybe even working in retail, or, you know, other areas as well that are associated, logistics and so on like that. So I think this thing around, multiple futures, and you don't know what that future is until you take the next step, and the flexibility and willingness of the enterprise, the social enterprise, to help you find that, but equally that bridge across to the employers on the outside requires some flexibility as well. So we've got some lovely relationships with our employer partners where there'll be a starting kind of job that the young person goes into, but after, you know, sort of a minimum period of time, things have stabilized, they've got the opportunity to go sideways within that organisation as well. So I think it's a multiplicity of possible futures is really what comes through, with continued support. So we continue with that post-placement support for at least 6 months after they leave our organisation. I think that's necessary as well.
Amazing. Michael, do you want to add some here from your perspective?
Yeah, so YLab's associate model is to recruit, train and pay local young people with sort of relevant lived experience to design and develop solutions to complex social challenges. So in the Brimbank example, for instance, we recruited 8 local young people to effectively act as like youth consultants, to work with Brimbank City Council employers and other stakeholders and other young people to develop these policies. So there's sort of like 2 tracks that we're treading on. One is that we provide employment through the actual program itself. So it's like this meta level of project work and also providing employment. But what we find, and very similar to what Kate said, is that range of work and the exposure to different industries and sectors allows young people to sort of get a leg up and increase that social connection and that social capital into that industry or sector. So the research findings was that, you know, there's a whole range of individual structural outcomes for young people. But one thing I think we see is that we see young people see an increased legitimacy of seeing someone like themselves in a certain pathway. And that sense of self-belief and self-confidence and understanding that they can make it in this industry is we see them sort of go from YLab into one of our partners and be poached by one of our partner organizations, ArcBlue being one of them, which I think Cam is on this call. And speaking of my own experiences, I started off as a YLab associate about 3 years ago, and I've then moved up into a manager role at the organization. So being able to see my own journey and my own employment pathway through YLab demonstrates that this model works for the young people that we work with as associates, but also the organization itself is built so that we can continue with the organization and move up as our skills and capabilities develop itself.
Excellent. Thanks, Michael. I don't know if you want to say anything here, Kirstan. Do you want to add anything?
Look, I agree with the comments that have been made already. The only addition I would make is that in some roles and in some situations where we can give the young person the opportunity to shape the role as well, I think we just get added value. Again, that's just a whole new level. And as I said, I'm so impressed by what young people bring today, and sometimes you say, here's the outcome we need to achieve, and they find a much better way to achieve that outcome than what many of us would have been traditionally thinking would have been that pathway.
Cool. Okay, I'm going to move to the question from Lisa, in working at food circles in Sardinia. I'm going to ask a couple of the panelists, but I'm also going to ask Jo about this question as well. So I think what Lisa's asking is how would her newly formed emerging youth social enterprise around farming and food, how would it reach out to use the learnings and framework and the research and be a real-time case study? So perhaps we could get some advice from the panel about how to be involved in research or how to do research as a social enterprise. And maybe then we can hand to Jo at the end to talk about this from her perspective. But Kate, I think you've been involved in quite a few research projects. I've seen some of the amazing research-oriented work that goes on in STREAT. Perhaps you could give us an inspiring kind of perspective on how a social enterprise could do this alone or in partnership.
Look, I don't know if I'll be inspiring, but Beck and I are research nerds. It's so important to us that where possible, what we do is evidence-informed, evidence-based, and we go out of our way to participate in really meaningful research. And sometimes it trips us up because where does research become just answering a question? And we'd probably be asked 3 or 4 times a week to sit down and talk with people and participate. And one of our 10 things on our strategic plan is actually to contribute generously back to the sector, because when we started, there were so many people who were so helpful to us, and we didn't have some of the amazing organisations and research centres and intermediaries that are there now to help new organisations start. So we really appreciate that and value it. My advice for new groups starting out would be to scour what you can. There's so much that's publicly available. You don't have to get behind the paywall of universities. There's a lot of stuff that has been made publicly available, especially through reputable groups such as yourselves and some others as well. So to gobble that up, and then I would say when any reputable research group comes along and says, can I do my master's study on you? Would you be part of a study for us? It might feel like it's sucking you away from the main game, but it's always worthwhile at the end. It's always worthwhile at the end. So that's my advice.
All these hidden benefits as well, isn't there? So Kirstan, how about, are there opportunities that Vic Health can afford to these emerging social enterprises? This whole idea of a real-time emerging case study sounds quite exciting. Give us some.
Absolutely. And I know Lisa very well, and Lisa is somebody who makes things happen. So I would love to kind of find a way to make this work for Lisa. So I think it comes back to the earlier comment I made, about why Vic Health funds research. It's important for us to create new knowledge, learn things that we didn't previously know, but the real value comes not from doing that, but from taking that and translating that to change. So this is where, when we do these research projects, we'll think, what is the translation plan? How are we going to affect real change as a result? So again, this is the value from the conversation. We need to find out what have we learned and what are the opportunities to implement that in practice. And Lisa, and there'll be others as well who would be able to benefit from our insights and yeah, put them straight away into practice. So,
want to add anything, Michael?
No, but it sounds great, Lisa, what you're doing, and you know, we work with a lot of young people at YLab, so be happy to chat if there's any way we could help with the learnings that we have operating at sort of a national scale, but also within local regions as well. So more of a plug for YLab.
Why not? That's what these platforms are for, right? Joe, do you want to give us a response to that? How could Lisa lean on the findings from this project and take forward her own research, do you think?
So Lisa, thanks for asking, and Perry's going to come on in a little while and actually show you some of the outputs, and we've tried to make the outputs meet the needs of diverse audiences, including social entrepreneurs and social enterprise practitioners, as well as policymakers and public health professionals and young people. So there's a lot of different audiences there. In terms of being a real life case study, I mean, I really think I get very excited about what we call transdisciplinary research, and Jane and a number of other colleagues are very experienced at this. It's just a bit of language that we're now attaching ourselves to, which is working across sectors and also bringing different disciplinary lenses. So, you know, for example, in a sort of food-based one, you might want some biological expertise alongside some social business expertise, alongside some, you know, youth employment expertise, or whatever it is. And I really think that's the future of social science. I think we need to be fast prototyping, working across sectors, learning and translating as we go. But at the same time, of course, taking care not to damage people who are already experiencing disadvantage through that process. So we're really excited about that model. Haven't worked out how to finance it yet, but we're getting there. So feel free to reach out.
Thanks, Joe. There's quite a few questions in there. Some I feel have been a little bit sort of tackled by some of the panel's questions and answers, but do you have a favourite question in there, Joe, that you would like to have answered?
I just want to make a couple of comments about the employment services system questions, and there's a few there relating to how do we get in and what are the issues about scaling social enterprises that might be holding us back. I just wanted to make a couple of observations. The first, and this is not at all a partisan comment because it's both sides of government, but at the federal level, we haven't seen any commitment to labour market activation of any serious nature since the early 1990s. So I don't think that WISEs should beat themselves up about the fact that they're marginalised. Pretty much any kind of deep labour market activation initiative has not been looked at until, interestingly, the last few months because of what's going on economically. So maybe now is an important non-partisan historical moment in which to, you know, really fire up this conversation about labour market activation and transitions. The issue, though, that's been picked up by Tim Bale is the issue of scale of social enterprises, and, you know, going back to Kate's reflections and things that Kylie said in the chat. Obviously, this is really labour-intensive work for relatively small cohorts of people. But I think one of the things there is going back to the evidence, and, you know, I'm not going to take personal responsibility for having been a community of scholarship of one for a very long time, but we clearly need to move into a space where collectively we're getting clear on what kinds of research evidence need to be generated and translated quickly. And there's a few. One is about the cost structures of work integration social enterprises, which Kylie's alluded to in the chat, and getting clear about what the margin for doing the social purpose is and how that is resourced. Another is really doing some good meta-analysis of the cost savings to government at all levels of government, and being clear about if you invest upstream, then this is the savings downstream, as well as the value created. So the value created is more the storytelling part. And, you know, I think we're getting collectively closer, but, you know, I think it was Kate who said something about, you know, making reference to intermediaries and research centres. We have to be realistic. We have a fairly atomised ecosystem in the Australian context. It's partly a result of, you know, inter-organisational politics, but it's largely a result of the way various parts of the ecosystem are resourced. In other countries, there's actually much more centralised resourcing of intermediaries and research centres, etc. Now, this is not an argument from a researcher for, give me lots of money. I'm just saying that, across the board, we need to find ways to make this ecosystem more joined up and looking outward and upward rather than looking inward at individual organisations and their needs.
Thanks, Jo. Yeah, look, I noticed there's a few questions in there, some of which have been addressed, but I'm going to take advantage of my chairperson status and ask the final obvious question, I think, which is, which sort of leads a bit from all of the things that you've been alluding to, which is that social enterprises are part of an ecosystem, that they can influence an ecosystem, but it's maybe an incremental process, that we've got some great research here, and there are many stakeholders and parts of this ecosystem that need to be influenced and moved and so on. So without sort of making that too leading, I wonder what you think the kind of next steps or the kind of capstone of this project that would make it kind of leap into influencing government and the ecosystem, or might actually be, should we, for example, be producing some sort of consensus statement or something like that. So I hand over to Michael, perhaps, to start this thought.
I go after Kate this time. I think I need some time to think.
All right, Kate, you can go. I like that, Michael. Good approach. Kate, I'm sure
seriously, you
seriously thought about this.
Threw me there. Thank you, buddy. I was very relieved because I was going to riff off what others were saying. Listen, I like the idea of consensus statements because I think even if we don't end up with kind of the perfect document that with a nice bow that results in immediate action, the process of doing it, I think, is valuable. Brings hopefully the right people to the table. And with consensus statements, one of the things I like about really good consensus statements, a bit like High Court judgments, is there's space for the alternate or the dissenting views. Because I think we can't fall into the trap of saying here is one way of doing it. I mean, obviously evidence-based will point us that way, but it's not completely a done deal. So I love the idea of a consensus statement with multiple voices, but with a little bit of space for acknowledging that we don't know it all yet, and there's room to kind of explore and grow there.
Love it.
Thanks for nothing, Michael.
Kirstan, I'm led to believe that Vic Health engages in consensus statements. How do you feel about this as a next step?
Yeah, look, I think it's a natural next step. So Vic Health got some good experience in facilitating consensus forming processes and landing on a statement, a series of agreed asks. Those asks can be of different parts of the system, but often those asks are of state government, or you can have asks at multiple levels as well. So agree with Kate's comments. I think that a consensus, the real value in a consensus statement, I guess, is to kind of say, here are the high level things we all agree on. And it doesn't mean that you can't care about things that aren't on that list as well. So the organisations that come together and unite around this consensus can say, yeah, we won't dispute this list of things, but it's okay if you also, have another thing that you want to throw in there as something you care about as well. So we've learned a lot from other topics, even way back with tobacco control and plain packaging and how difficult it was when the sector did not have consensus around what should happen. We give a great excuse to governments and decision makers to not act. Over more recent times, we've formed consensus around childhood obesity and how to prevent it. We're currently working through consensus processes around food systems, what a good food system would look like. And once we get everybody, big key players all agreeing on the high level set, we're much more likely to create some change. We're also doing the same thing around coronavirus and what the opportunities it brings for walking and bike riding in local neighbourhoods. And so when you've got a kind of a diverse group of stakeholders, to get everybody to land on a common set, I think is amazingly valuable. Yeah.
That's great. We'll call you. Michael, I know that you strategically set this up so you had the last word. Do you have the last word?
Yeah, I think, I agree with everything that's been said. I think one process, I think it has to happen organically. And one thing that we're trying to do at YLab, and in particular with our work in the West, is that we've worked in this region for over sort of 4 or 5 years now. And we have a variety of disparate projects sort of across the West to do with the youth sector and more broadly. And what we're trying to do with the grant that we received from HMST is to actually connect and form a community of entrepreneurs within these different and diverse networks. So getting young people who work within a system but don't think like a system, who understand co-design, who understand social entrepreneurship, who understand the value of experimenting to do with policy. And I think if broadly, if we can do this as a, not just as YLab itself, but as a broader sector, and bring together all the disparate projects that work within, just say, the hospitality and food industry, but also the youth sector and policy, for instance, I think you can start to see some organic consensus come about. Because as you said, having a disparate, having such a big sector with disparate voices and consenting voices, it's going to be hard to just achieve that with one sort of statement. And I think if you get that through project-based work and what's proven to work and what's proven to be agreed on, I think we can, I mean, that's where it can start, I believe.
Thanks very much. And thanks to all of the panel for their quick wits and great insights. I'm now going to hand over to Perry to talk about the project resources.
Thanks, Jane. And hi, everyone. I'd just like to give you a quick look at two of our project outputs. And I think if we just flick over to the next slide, thanks, Marta, we'll go straight onto the first link, which will take us to the website, which will just load for a second, or maybe more. Just bear with me while that loads up for a sec. So we can see here the website, which is called Design for Wellbeing, a Social Enterprise Story. And if we scroll down, we can see there's plenty of information there about how place and space affects wellbeing. And if we scroll right down to the very bottom, we'll be able to get to the interactive visual. And if you click on that, yep, perfect. So this is our interactive visual where we've put in all the types of ways that space and organisational features can be used in designing a WISE for health and wellbeing outcomes. And we're clicking on some things here to have a look inside. And if we drag across to that blue shed there, you'll be able to click on the little box above that. And we can find out that a caring, collaborative and friendly culture enables young people to learn and develop skills. And in this kind of environment, young people feel safe to try new things. So there's also many great tips on the health benefits of outdoor spaces from Jane and her team, who have significantly contributed to the development of this website. And I'll let you explore that a bit more for yourselves later on, as we've only got a couple of minutes here. So I'll move on to the policy guides slide if we want to click back to that. Thanks, Marta. Thanks for all this switching to and fro. In the policy guide, which is just on the next slide across, perfect, we're communicating the priorities for policy, health and social enterprise professionals and for governments, such as recognising social enterprises within employment services system. And similarly to the webpage, the guide summarises how and why organisational design affects health outcomes and provides 4 key better practice features, which we've listed here. And these are diverse work setting and spaces for learning, flexible and responsive wraparound support, a blended culture of education and employment, and respectful and inclusive workplaces. So we're launching this policy guide today, and we'll provide you with the link to the policy guide in the chat function. And I'll pass over to Jo for her to continue on. Thanks, Marta, for that.
Thanks, Perry. Just very briefly, we're conscious of time. We're losing people as one does when we're doing webinars that go for more than an hour, but we've got a couple more things to do. The most exciting bit is seeing Jessmy's reflections on what our discussion looked like today. Before we did that, we just wanted to talk about next steps in the research process. We've covered off on quite a bit of that in the Q&A, so it won't take long, but did want to invite a couple of colleagues to reflect if they wanted to. The one thing I did want to say is the issue of scaling social work integration, social enterprises is the subject of the next Linkage grant application that we're currently putting together. The partners for that project are White Box Enterprises, Jigsaw, Outlook and the Westpac Foundation, and we hope that that's going to provide some more insight and evidence from a systems perspective into what's needed to effectively scale WISEs. I just wanted to see whether Chris Mason and Andrew Joyce from our team are here and if they wanted to make any comments about other future directions for research very briefly.
Thanks, Jo. I'm here.
Yeah, I can, Chris, you go.
Yeah, so my role on the project was really looking at the board in the social enterprise case studies and understanding how the board and its processes influence the outcomes in some way that the organisations wanted to achieve. So big picture, I'd say there's a lot there to say about board effectiveness, board dynamics, and learning how the board connects what goes on inside the organisation and connects with the social mission to enabling the organisation through advocacy and networking outside of the organisation itself. So I think that's going to be a really big opportunity to develop capacity for social enterprises, and of course WISEs, but more broadly, and potentially even raise awareness of what those issues mean to the wider community, the governance community, and so on. So I think they're the big opportunities from my side. Andrew?
Yeah, and from my perspective, I was looking at sort of the health and wellbeing impacts that we're writing up at the moment. And from an evaluation point of view, which a lot of the work that I do at the centre, people often ask me how they can measure their impact. And often I say, well, that's pretty challenging. It's pretty complex what you're doing. One of the interesting things to emerge that's been talked about a lot this morning was this idea of workplace inclusion and work group inclusion, and there's a recent scale that's been published on that. So I think that might be something interesting to explore with social enterprises. And also for workplaces more generally, if we're trying to get this on the radar, this idea of something that's important to track, as Kirstan's has already mentioned, job control, job demand, we know that's important for stress and wellbeing. And we do measure that, and certainly workplace inclusion is something else we might be able to measure as a systems leverage point to get us on the agenda of mainstream employers as well.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Chris. And acknowledging that we've got multiple other team members, we didn't want to overcook today's webinar by hearing from everyone, but if you're interested in the policy directions, not specific to social enterprise, but other aspects of health and wellbeing, Associate Professor Gemma Carey is also a member of the team, and I think she's in the audience somewhere. She sent me a text earlier, and just acknowledging that there's a wide variety of people have been involved in doing this research, all of whom from the researcher side are, you know, continuing in interesting directions with future work, which is both practically and useful and of scholarly benefit. So now we get to the bit that I'm most excited about from the whole webinar, and I don't mean in any way to disrespect everything that's come before it, but hopefully if the technology allows us, we can get Jessamy to show us how she's depicted our discussion today. Look at that. Are you going to speak, Jessamy? You're on mute. I'm not sure if Jessamy's speaking, but here we are. This is our discussion. Does it resonate? Tell us in the Q&A if it's gotten what we needed. Thinking about that consensus statement, we can use some of this. Sorry, in the chat function, I should say, not the Q&A. Yeah, good. I'm glad you think it looks amazing, Michael. Jessamy's my all-time favourite graphic recorder. Thanks for doing it, Jessamy. I think it really captures a lot of what we've been talking about without overcooking the actual, you know, findings from the project, which we've already got in other formats. So thanks very much. We really appreciate it. So that basically brings us to the end of the webinar. I just want to thank everyone for turning up. It's always fabulous. There are obviously many people of an existing community who come to these webinars around social enterprise, but also always new people. So thanks for joining. And my big thanks to everyone in the project team, to all of our panellists, to all of our industry partners, to all of the social enterprises, and to YLab for hosting us today. It's been a pleasure to do this, and we can officially declare this project outputs launched and move on to the rest of our day. So thank you very much.